Imagine a mysterious gray dog appearing out of nowhere to save a priest from assassins, then vanishing without a trace. Picture a poor farmer's son who could read souls and multiply food to feed hungry children. What if I told you these extraordinary events were just small parts of one of the most remarkable stories in Catholic history, the life of St. John Bosco, who transformed the lives of countless abandoned youth and built a worldwide movement that continues growing 200 years later. Let me introduce you to the saint who forever changed how we work with young people. The Miracles and Prophecies of St. John Bosco, a project of America Needs Fatima. I'm your host, Adrian Fonseca. Subscribe for new episodes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. In early 1800s Italy, a perfect storm was brewing. The Industrial Revolution drew thousands of young people into cities, leaving them homeless and hopeless. Traditional education methods weren't working. The Catholic Church was facing unprecedented challenges from Masonic forces. Into this chaos stepped one extraordinary priest with an innovative solution that would forever change youth ministry and education. Today, we're exploring the incredible journey of St. John Bosco, from his prophetic childhood dreams to building a worldwide movement that continues transforming lives. We'll witness miracles, encounter mysterious protectors, and discover an approach to education built on love of souls instead of fear. This overview will introduce you to Don Bosco's remarkable story, but there is so much more to explore. Each aspect we touch on today, his prophecies, educational method, mystical gifts, and worldwide mission, reveals fascinating details that we'll explore in future videos. Whether you're discovering Don Bosco for the first time or already know parts of his story, prepare to be amazed by one of the most influential saints of modern times. Let me know in the comments if you've ever heard of Don Bosco before, or if this is your first time learning about this remarkable saint. The making of a saint. The early life of St. John Bosco, 1815 to 1841. On August 16, 1815, as Napoleon Bonaparte began his exile in St. Helena, John Melchior Bosco was born in the small farming village of Becci, near Turin, Italy. Born to humble peasant farmers, Francisco Bosco and Margareta Ochiena, known affectionately as Mama Margaret. His early life was marked by hardship when his father died in 1817, leaving Margaret to raise three boys alone: Anthony from Francisco's first marriage, Joseph, and young John. Despite their poverty, Margaret was a woman of profound faith who deeply influenced her youngest son's spiritual formation. She taught him, "God gave you life, expecting you to make good use of it." This maternal wisdom would shape his future ministry. John had a prophetic dream at the age of 9 that would define his life's mission. In this vision, he found himself among fighting boys who were cursing. As he tried to stop them with his fists, a mysterious man appeared, saying, "Not with blows, but with gentleness and charity must you draw these friends to the path of virtue." Then a noble lady appeared, telling him, "Make yourself humble, strong, and robust. At the proper time, you will understand everything." This dream would recur throughout his life, growing clearer in meaning as his vocation developed. Young John showed remarkable initiative in pursuing his calling. He would attend fairs to watch jugglers and acrobats, carefully studying their tricks. After mastering these skills, he would put on the shows for local children, following each performance with a recitation of the Sunday sermon and prayers. Through these early experiences, he discovered how to use entertainment to draw young people to God. A significant turning point came when he met Don Colosso, the priest at Meraldo, whom he called his guardian angel. After hearing young John repeat from memory 2 sermons delivered at a mission in Becci in 1826, Don Colosso took an interest in the boy. When John explained his desire to become a priest, quote, "in order to instruct the many youths who get into wrongdoing and evil ways, because no one is interested in them," end quote, Don Colosso began giving him lessons and found him to be a very apt pupil. Though Don Colosso died just a year later, his influence was pivotal in John's development. At 15, John attended the public school at Castelnuovo, having to walk from Becce twice daily, a 10-mile journey, as he could not afford to buy a midday meal. A tailor named Roberto at Castelnuovo eventually housed him, teaching him the tailoring trade, and as Roberto was also the choir master at the parish church, taught him plain chant. John learned to play the violin and harmonium, eventually becoming qualified as an organist. He gained varied work experience, spending time in Savio's iron working shop, learning the mechanic's craft, living with a restaurant keeper named Pianta, where he became so skilled at confectionery that he was offered a partnership, which he of course refused, and at Cherry learning shoemaking. This diverse knowledge of trades and his understanding of artisan lives would prove invaluable in his future work. When John entered the seminary, his family was so poor that priests and parishioners had to help provide his clerical outfit. Despite this poverty, he became a model seminarian, known for his solidity, composure, and reliability, so much so that they called him the Father. His holiness grew significantly through his friendship with Luigi Comolo, a saintly fellow student who died in 1839 before reaching 22 years of age. After death, Comolo appeared to John in a vision of brilliant light, declaring, "Bosco! Bosco! Bosco! I am saved!" On June 5, 1841, John Bosco was ordained to the priesthood. At his first Mass celebrated at the Church of St. Francis of Assisi in Turin, he made a prayer that would define his ministry. He asked for, quote, "the power of persuasion to be able to do good to souls," end quote. His mother's words to him that day proved prophetic. "You are a priest. In saying Mass henceforward, you are then nearest to Jesus Christ. Remember, however, that to begin to say Mass means to begin to suffer. You will not realize it at once, but little by little, you will see that your mother has told you the truth. I am confident that you will pray for me every day, whether I am living or dead. That is enough for me. Henceforth, think only of the salvation of souls, and don't be troubled in mind about me." From priest to founder, Don Bosco's path to the Salesian Society, 1841 to 1859. Don Bosco began his ministry in Turin during a critical period of social upheaval. The Industrial Revolution had drawn thousands of young people to the city seeking work, leaving many to fend for themselves, swelling the ranks of the unemployed and homeless. An assistant chaplain at the Convito Ecclesiastico, where he continued his theological studies, he witnessed the plight of these vulnerable youth firsthand. A pivotal moment came on December 8, 1841, the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. While preparing for Mass, Don Bosco met Bartholomew Gorelli, a young orphan whom the sacristan was about to chase from the church. Discovering that Gorelli couldn't read, write, or even make the sign of the cross, Don Bosco began teaching him catechism. Soon Gorelli brought other boys, and the oratory was born. Don Bosco sought out these street boys, apprentices, chimney sweeps, and bricklayers in workplaces, prisons, and marketplaces. Using his skills as a juggler and acrobat to attract their attention, he would gather them on Sundays for catechism, games, and Mass. His work faced constant challenges as the growing group of boys needed a permanent meeting place. They moved from churches to fields and temporary locations as neighbors complained about the noise. Finally, in 1846, Don Bosco secured a permanent home by leasing a shed from Francis Pinardi in the Valdocco district of Turin. This humble beginning would become the mother house of the Salesian order. That same year, exhausted by his work, Don Bosco fell gravely ill. During his recovery, his mother Margaret came to live with him at the oratory, becoming a second mother to his boys. Mama Margaret would remain there until she died in 1856, helping to create the family atmosphere that would characterize Salesian education. During this critical time, Don Bosco's devotion to Mary, Help of Christians, deepened further, as he attributed his recovery to her maternal protection. The Revolution of 1848 brought new challenges in Italy. Political tensions were high, and Don Bosco faced unjust suspicion from liberals and conservatives, He maintained careful neutrality, focusing instead on expanding the oratory to include night schools, workshops, and a home for orphans. His educational philosophy, which he called the preventive system, emphasized reason, religion, and loving kindness rather than punishment. He insisted that educators should be like fathers among their students, creating an environment of joy and trust. As his work grew, Don Bosco began forming his own collaborators. Several of his early boys showed interest in the priesthood, including Michael Rua, who would become his first successor. In 1854, Don Bosco gathered 4 young men and proposed that they unite to do good works, while testing a form of consecrated life. This informal group became the nucleus of the Salesian Society. Throughout this period, Don Bosco continued to be guided by prophetic dreams. In one significant vision, he saw his boys transformed from wild animals into gentle lambs under the guidance of Mary, Help of Christians, whose protection would become central to Salesian spirituality. The formal founding of the Salesian Society took place on December 18, 1859, when Don Bosco and 17 others established the Society of St. Francis de Sales. They chose this name to honor the gentle spirit of Francis de Sales and to indicate their commitment to using kindness rather than severity in their work with youth. This marked the transition from local work to something much broader, though formal church approval would take several more years to obtain. During these foundational years, Don Bosco also pioneered practical initiatives for youth welfare, negotiating some of the first apprenticeships contracts in Italy to protect young workers from exploitation. He established printing workshops, taught trades, and wrote popular religious books for the young, earning recognition from both church and civil authorities, despite continued opposition from various quarters. The establishment of the Salesian Society ensured that Don Bosco's work would continue beyond his lifetime. What began with a simple catechism lesson for one poor boy had grown into a religious congregation dedicated to the education and evangelization of youth, guided by his motto, "Give me souls, take away the rest." The final chapter, From Founder to Saint, 1859 to 1888. In establishing the Salesian Society, Don Bosco found an unlikely ally in Urban Ratazzi, the Minister of the Interior, who helped him structure a new kind of religious congregation, compatible with both church and civil law. Members would maintain their civil rights while being religious in the eyes of the church, a new approach that initially faced opposition but ultimately succeeded. In 1864, Pope Pius IX issued Decretum Laudis, Decree of Praise, for the Salesian Society. During this period, the original oratory at Valdoco became a model for other foundations, combining youth centers, schools, churches, and technical workshops. In 1872, with papal encouragement, Don Bosco founded the Daughters of Mary, Help of Christians, the Salesian Sisters, with Maria Mazzarello as the first superior, extending the Salesian mission to girls. By 1876, he had established the Salesian Cooperators, enabling lay people to share in the Salesian mission while living in the world. One of Don Bosco's crowning achievements was the construction of the Basilica of Mary, Help of Christians in Turin, completed in 1868. Built without initial funds, though countless miraculous donations, it became the spiritual center of the Salesian family. The 1870s saw the movement expand beyond Europe, with the first Salesian missionaries departing for Argentina in 1875, fulfilling Don Bosco's vision of reaching South America, particularly Patagonia. As his health declined, Don Bosco continued working tirelessly. People sought him out for counsel, blessings, and healings. Even skeptics were impressed by his practical achievements in education and social reform. He maintained his focus on preventative education, insisting, quote, "It is not enough to love the young. They must know that they are loved," end quote. In his final months, he received a constant stream of visitors, his spiritual sons and daughters, benefactors, and former students. His last message to his Salesians emphasized the importance of work for youth and devotion to Mary, Help of Christians. Don Bosco died on January 31st, 1888. His last words being, "Tell my boys, I await them all in paradise." At the time of his death, the Salesian Society numbered 768 members, working in 64 houses across Europe and South America. Along with hundreds of Salesian sisters and thousands of cooperators, his funeral in Turin drew thousands, with many already acclaiming him as a saint. The church moved quickly to recognize his holiness. He was beatified in 1929 and canonized on Easter Sunday, April 1st, 1934, by Pope Pius XI, who had known him personally. Epilogue: The Extraordinary and the Ordinary. Several remarkable elements of Don Bosco's life deserve special mention beyond the main narrative. Perhaps most intriguing was his mysterious dog Grigio, the Grey One, who appeared unexpectedly numerous times between 1852 and 1866 to protect him from attackers. This large gray dog would materialize when Don Bosco was in danger, escort him safely home, and then disappear. Despite attempts to feed or house it, the dog would vanish until the next time it was needed. The last appearance of Grigio was in 1866 in Liguria, when it guided Don Bosco through treacherous mountain paths during a storm. Don Bosco possessed extraordinary gifts that he used humbly in service of his mission. He had the ability to read consciences, often telling people their sins before confession. He demonstrated prophetic knowledge, predicting deaths and future events with remarkable accuracy. The multiplication of chestnuts and consecrated hosts occurred several times when he needed to feed or give communion to his boys, not to mention bilocations and miraculous healings. However, he never drew attention to these phenomena, seeing them simply as tools for his work. The dream of two columns is worth noting. In this vision from 1862, Don Bosco saw the church as a ship anchored between two pillars, one topped by the Eucharist, the other by Mary, help of Christians. This prophetic dream is often interpreted as describing the church's struggles in modern times and its sources of strength, the Holy Eucharist and Our Lady. Don Bosco was also a prolific writer, producing over 150 works. His Catholic reading series provided affordable religious education for common people. He wrote biographies of exemplary youth, including St. Dominic Savio, one of his students who died at the age of 14 and was later canonized. The phenomenon of bilocation was reported several times in his life, with credible witnesses seeing him simultaneously in different places. While he never spoke of these occurrences, they were well documented by others. After his death, numerous miracles were attributed to his intercession. During the process of his canonization, over 1,000 authenticated testimonies were presented. The speed of his canonization process was remarkable for the time, reflecting both his widespread reputation for holiness and the abundance of miraculous evidence. Don Bosco's story doesn't end here. In fact, we're just getting started. If you've been captivated by his prophecies, intrigued by his miracles, or inspired by his educational approach, you're in the right place. We dive deep into every aspect of his extraordinary life every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Hit subscribe and that notification bell right now to join our community of disciples of Don Bosco, discovering how his wisdom remains relevant today. Did the mysterious gray dog capture your imagination? We have a full video exploring all his appearances. Fascinated by Don Bosco's prophetic dreams? We produced multiple episodes breaking them down. Every story, every miracle, every aspect of his extraordinary educational method. We explore it all. Don't miss out on these incredible stories. Like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs to hear about this remarkable saint. Join the conversation below. I would love to know which of Don Bosco's story resonated most with you, and what you'd like to learn more about in future videos. From a humble farm in northern Italy to becoming one of the most influential saints in modern times, Don Bosco's extraordinary journey reminds us that with faith, dedication, and divine providence, seemingly impossible dreams can become reality. Throughout our exploration today, we've witnessed how his childhood vision became a transformative movement, how his innovative approach reformed educational methods, and how supernatural gifts served his mission to save souls. Each aspect we've touched on today, from his prophetic dreams to the mysterious Grigio, from his educational methods to his remarkable miracles, has its own fascinating story that we explore in depth on our channel. If you're intrigued by any particular part of Don Bosco's life, you'll find multiple videos in our library diving deep into these topics. Don Bosco's life offers us timeless lessons that love must precede learning, that joy and holiness go hand in hand, and that gentleness achieves more than force ever could. Perhaps most importantly, he showed us that extraordinary holiness often works through ordinary means: teaching, playing, working, and simply being present to those in need. What aspect of Don Bosco's story did you like the most? Was it his unwavering trust in divine providence, his innovative approach to education, or perhaps his extraordinary spiritual gifts? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I would love to hear which elements of his story speaks to your heart. If you're new here, dive into our extensive collection of videos exploring every fascinating aspect of Don Bosco's life and legacy. And if you've been inspired by his story, share it with someone who could benefit from his examples today. St. John Bosco, pray for us. May God bless you, and Mary, help of Christians, keep you under her mantle. God love you.
In a poem by St. Teresa of Avila, she proclaims, "I am not moved, my God, to love thee by the heaven thou hast promised me, nor am I moved by fear of hell to cease for that reason to offend thee. Thou art what moves me, Lord. It moves me to see thee nailed to a cross and scorned." St. Teresa of Avila's words were the highest expression of a disinterested love, for she loved our Lord ardently without any motivation by personal benefit. However, until we achieve that degree of sanctity, we need to be reminded of the pains of hell to move us along the path of holiness. That's why hearing about all the horrors in St. John Bosco's mystical dream of hell is a gift from God that we should appreciate and take advantage of. He didn't have to give us a glimpse of the afterlife, but revealed it to Don Bosco because he loves us. Listening to this entire dream should be done calmly and with complete confidence in God, but not forgetting that God is letting you hear this story so you can repent and suffer for your sins in this life rather than burn in the next. And so we begin our 4-part series on Don Bosco's vision of hell. Buckle up. You're watching The Miracles and Prophecies of St. John Bosco, a project of America Needs Fatima. I'm your host, Matthew Miller. Don Bosco resumed narrating his dreams on Sunday night, May 3, 1868, the feast of St. Joseph's patronage. He mounted the podium and said, "I have another dream to tell you, which, in a way, completes the ones I told you last Thursday and Friday, and they left me totally exhausted. Call them dreams, call them anything you wish, but as you know, on the night of April 17th, a frightening toad seemed ready to swallow me alive. When it disappeared, a voice said to me, 'Why don't you tell them?' I turned and saw a distinguished person standing next to my bed. Feeling reproached by my silence, I asked, 'What should I tell our boys?' 'Tell them what you saw and heard in your latest dreams, and things you will know which will be revealed to you tomorrow night.' Then he vanished. I spent the entire next day concerned about the miserable night in store for me. When evening came, unwilling to go to bed, I sat at my desk, leafing through books until midnight. I was horrified at the mere thought of having more nightmares. Finally, with great effort, I went to bed. Afraid of going to sleep, and starting to dream immediately, I set my pillow upright against the headboard and practically sat up, but I was so exhausted that I soon fell asleep. The same person from the night before immediately appeared. Don Bosco often called him the man with the cap, or beretta. "Get up and follow me," he commanded. "For heaven's sake," I protested. "Leave me alone. I'm exhausted. A toothache has tormented me for many days, and I need to rest. I've had awful nightmares that have completely worn me out." So I said, because this person's apparition always brought me trouble. He answered, "Get up. You have no time to waste." I got up and followed him, asking, "Where are you taking me?" "Come and you'll see." He led me to a vast, lifeless desert without a soul, tree, or brook. Its yellow and dried-up vegetation offered a sad spectacle. I had no idea where I was or what I had to do. I even lost sight of my guide for a moment and feared that I was lost. Father Rua, Father Franchesia, and the others were out of sight. I sighed in relief when I finally saw my friend coming toward me. "Where am I?" I asked. "Come with me and you'll see." "All right." I followed him in silence, but after a long and dismal walk, I began to worry whether I would ever manage to cross that vast plain with my toothache and swollen legs. However, I suddenly saw a road ahead. "Where to now?" I asked. "This way," he answered. We set out on that beautiful, wide, and neatly paved road, reminiscent of the verse from the book of Sirach. The way of sinners is smooth stones, and at their end are hell and darkness and pain. The road was lined on both sides with magnificent green hedges dotted with gorgeous flowers. Roses sprung everywhere through the leaves. At first glance, this road was level and comfortable, and I unsuspectingly ventured upon it. However, I soon noticed that it, almost imperceptibly, kept sloping downward. While it didn't look steep, I was moving so swiftly that I felt as if I was effortlessly airborne. I was really gliding and hardly using my feet. It suddenly dawned on me that the return trip would be very long and arduous, so I asked, "How shall we get back to the oratory?" "Don't worry. The Lord Almighty wants you to go. Your guide will know how to lead you back," he answered. The road kept sloping downward. As we went on our way, flanked by roses and other flowers, I realized that I was being followed by the oratory boys and large crowds of others I had never met. I somehow found myself in their midst. Looking at them, I noticed how one or the other would drop to the ground and be dragged by an unseen force toward a scary, distant slope that descended into a furnace. "What's making these boys fall?" I asked. "Take a closer look," he replied. I got closer and saw traps everywhere, reminding me of Psalm 139, "Funes extenderunt in laquium, juxta iter scandalum posuerunt." They have spread cords for a net. By the wayside they have laid snares for me. Some were close to the ground, others at eye level, but all were well concealed. Many boys, unaware of the danger, got caught and tripped. They fell to the ground with their legs in the air, and as soon as they managed to get up, they ran straight down the road toward the abyss. Some got trapped by the head, others by the neck, hand, arms, legs, or sides, and were pulled down immediately. The ground traps were as fine as spiders' webs, and barely visible. While seemingly very flimsy and harmless, every boy they caught fell to the ground. The guide, seeing my astonishment, asked, "Do you know what this is?" "It's only some filmy fiber," I answered. He added, "It's nothing but plain human respect." However, seeing many boys caught in those traps, I asked, "Why do so many get caught in this net? Who's pulling them down?" He responded, "Get closer and you'll see." I watched a bit and said, "I don't see anything." "Look closer," he insisted. I picked up one of the traps, pulled on it, and immediately felt some resistance. I pulled harder, but felt I was being pulled down instead of drawing the thread closer. Unable to resist, I soon found myself at the entrance of a frightening cave. I stopped, unwilling to venture into that deep cavern, and started pulling the thread toward me once again. It only gave a little through a strenuous effort on my part. After much tugging, a huge and ugly monster appeared, clutching a rope to which all those traps were tied. It was he who instantly dragged down anyone getting caught in them. I said to myself, "There's no way I can overcome this ugly monster. I'll certainly lose. I'd better fight him with the sign of the cross and ejaculations." As I went back to my guide, he said, "Now you know who it is, don't you?" "For sure. It's the devil himself setting traps to drag my boys into hell." I carefully checked many traps and saw that each bore a title: pride, disobedience, envy, sixth commandment, theft, gluttony, sloth, anger, and so on. I stepped back a bit to see which ones trapped the greater number of boys. I found that the most dangerous were impurity, disobedience, and pride, which indeed were linked together. Several other traps did great harm, but not as much as the first two. I kept watching and noticed that many boys ran faster than others. I asked, "Why so much haste?" "They are being dragged by the snare of human respect." Looking more closely, I saw knives scattered here and there among the traps. A providential hand put them there for souls to cut themselves free. The bigger knife was to be used against the trap of pride and symbolized meditation. Other knives, not quite as big, symbolized well-made spiritual reading. There were also 2 swords. One represented devotion to the Blessed Sacrament, especially through frequent Holy Communion, the other, devotion to the Blessed Mother. There was also a hammer symbolizing confession. Other knives represented devotion to Saint Joseph, Saint Aloysius, and other saints. A good number of boys managed to break free or evade capture by these means. In fact, I saw lads walking safely through those traps, either by passing before the trap sprung on them or by making it slip off. Once my guide figured I had observed everything, he made me continue along that rose-hedged road. However, the farther we went, the scarcer the roses became, and long thorns began to show up. Soon there were no more roses. The hedges became thorny, leafless, and sun-scorched. Dead branches from the bushes lay along the road, littering it with thorns and making it impassable. We came to a ravine whose steep sides hid what lay beyond. Still sloping downward, the road became ever more terrifying, rutted and strewn with rocks and boulders. I lost track of all my boys, most of whom had left this treacherous road and taken other paths. As I kept going, the further I advanced, the more arduous and steep the descent became. I tumbled and fell several times, lying or sitting down until I could catch my breath. From time to time, my guide supported me or helped me to rise. My joints seemed to give way at every step. I thought my shin bones would snap and said to my guide, panting, "My friend, I can no longer stand on my legs. It's impossible for me to keep going." He said nothing and continued walking. I felt encouraged and followed until he saw me soaked in sweat and thoroughly exhausted. He then mercifully led me to a little clearing alongside the road. I sat down, took a deep breath, and felt better. From there I looked at the road I had traveled. It looked very steep, jagged, and strewn with loose stones. However, what lay ahead seemed so much worse that I closed my eyes in horror, pleading, "Let's go back. How can we ever get back to the oratory if we go any farther? I'll never make it back up this slope." My guide sternly answered, "Do you want me to leave you here now that we have come so far?" At this threat I wailed, "How can I return or go ahead without your help?" "Then follow me," he said. I rose, and we continued our descent. The road now became so frightfully steep that it was almost impossible to stand erect. Then an enormous building loomed into sight at the bottom of this precipice, at the entrance of a dark valley. Its towering portal was tightly locked and faced our road. When we got to the bottom of the abyss, I was smothered by suffocating heat, while a greasy, green-tinted smoke rose with flashes of scarlet flames from behind those enormous walls which loomed higher than a mountain. I asked my guide, "Where are we? What is this?" "Read the inscription on that portal, and you'll know," he answered. I looked up and read, "Ubi non est redemptio," the place of no reprieve. I realized that we were at the gates of hell. The guide led me around the walls of this horrible place. At regular distances, bronze portals like the first overlooked precipitous descents. Each had an inscription such as these two from the Gospel of Matthew: Descedite maledicti in ignem aeternum qui paratus est diablo et angelis eius. Depart from me, you cursed, into everlasting fire, which was prepared for the devil and his angels. Omnis arbor, quae non facit fructum bonum exciditur et in ignem mittetur. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. I took my notebook to copy them, but my guide said, "Stop, what are you doing?" "I am copying these inscriptions." He answered, "There's no need. They're all in Holy Scripture. You even have some inscribed at your entrances." At that sight, I wanted to turn back and return to the oratory. I took a few steps, but my guide shrugged off my attempt. After going through a huge, steep ravine, we again came to the foot of the precipice facing the first portal. The guide suddenly turned to me, upset and startled, motioning me to step aside. "Look out!" Terrified, I saw in the distance someone racing down the path at breakneck speed. As he got closer, I saw it was one of my boys. His disheveled hair partly stood upright on his head and was partly tossed back by the wind. His arms were outstretched as if thrashing on the water to stay afloat. He wanted to stop, but couldn't. He fell even faster as he tripped on the protruding stones. I shouted, holding out my hands in a vain effort to restrain him, "Let's help him! Let's stop him!" The guide said, "Leave him alone." "Why can't I stop him?" "Don't you know how terrible God's vengeance is? Do you think you could stop someone fleeing from his burning wrath?" Meanwhile, the youth turned his fiery gaze backward to see if God's wrath was still pursuing him. He then tumbled down the ravine and crashed against the bronze portal as if he could find no better refuge in his flight. I asked, why was he looking backward in terror? "Because God's wrath pierces all gates of hell to torment him, even in the midst of fire." The portal sprang wide open with a roar as the boy crashed into it. Instantly 1,000 inner portals opened, clanging as if struck by a body propelled by an invisible, violent, and irresistible wind. Although these bronze doors were a considerable distance from each other, as the doors remained momentarily open, I saw far into the distance something like furnace jaws spouting fiery balls as the young man hurtled into it. The portals then clanged shut as swiftly as they had opened. I again took my notebook and tried to jot down the name of that unfortunate lad, but the guide held my arm, saying, "Wait and watch again." As I watched, another 3 of our boys rolled down one behind the other like boulders, screaming in terror with arms outstretched. I recognized the 3 as they crashed against the portal. It sprang open in a split second, and so did the other 1,000. As the 3 lads were sucked into that endless corridor, I heard a drawn-out, fading, infernal echo, and the portals clanged shut. Many other boys came tumbling down after them from time to time. I saw one unlucky boy pushed down the slope by an evil companion. Others fell alone, or with other boys, arm in arm or side by side. Each bore the name of his sin on his forehead. I kept calling them as they hurtled down, but they didn't hear me. The portals again opened thunderously and slammed shut with a rumble. A deadly silence ensued. My guide exclaimed, "Here you have the causes for so many lost souls, bad companions, bad books, and bad habits." The traps I saw earlier indeed dragged the boys to ruin. Seeing so many of them lost, I cried out with affliction, "If so many of our boys end up this way, our educational work is useless. How can we prevent this calamity?" The guide responded, "This is their present state, and here is where they would come if they were to die now. So let me write their names to warn them and set them back on the path to heaven." "Do you really believe some of them would amend if you warned them? Your warning might impress them for a moment, but they will soon forget it, saying, 'It was just a dream.' And they'll do worse than before. Others, seeing they have been unmasked, will frequent the sacraments, but not in an uprightly spontaneous nor meritorious way. Still others will go to confession because of a momentary fear of hell, but will remain attached to sin." "Then there's no way to save these poor wretches? Please tell me what I can do for them." "They have superiors? Let them obey. They have rules? Let them observe them. They have the sacraments. Let them receive them." At that point, a new group of boys came hurtling down, and the portals momentarily opened, and the guide said to me, "Come inside with me." I pulled back in horror. I couldn't wait to rush back to the oratory to warn the boys, lest others might be lost. But my guide insisted, "Come and you will learn much. But first tell me, do you want to go alone or with me?" He asked this to make me realize that I lacked strength and thus needed his friendly assistance. I replied, "Alone into that horrible place? How could I ever find my way out without your help?" A thought then dawned on me that aroused my courage. One must be judged before he is condemned to hell, and I haven't been judged yet. So I resolutely exclaimed, "Let's go." We entered that narrow, horrible corridor with lightning speed. A threatening inscription shone eerily over each of the inner gateways. The last one opened into a vast and grim courtyard with a large and ominous entrance at the far end. Above it stood this inscription, "Ibunt impii in ignem aeternum," and these, the wicked, shall go into everlasting fire, a verse from the Gospel of Matthew. All walls were similarly inscribed. I asked my guide permission to read them, which he granted. I looked at the Latin inscriptions and started reading one after the next. Translated, they read, "I will give fire into their flesh, that they may burn forever." The Book of Judith. "The smoke of their torments goes up forever and ever. They will be tormented day and night forever and ever." The Book of the Apocalypse. "There is no peace to the wicked." The Book of Isaiah. "Here all kinds of torments forever and ever. Here disorder and everlasting horror dwell." The Book of Job. "There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth." The Gospel of Matthew. As I moved from one inscription to another, my guide, who stood in the center of the courtyard, came up to me, saying, "From here on, no one may have a helpful companion, a comforting friend, a loving heart, a compassionate glance, or a benevolent word. We've crossed the line. Would you just want to see these things, or experience them yourself?" "I just want to see," I answered. "Then come with me," my friend added. Taking me by the hand, he stepped through that gate into a corridor at whose far end stood an observation deck, closed by a huge crystal pane from floor to ceiling. As I crossed its threshold, I felt untold terror and dared not take another step. I saw ahead of me something like an immense cave which gradually disappeared into deep recesses in the bowels of the mountain. Everything was ablaze, but not with an earthly fire, with leaping tongues of flames. The cave's walls, ceiling, floor, iron, stones, wood, and coal were glowing white at temperatures of thousands of degrees. However, the fire neither incinerated nor consumed anything. I cannot find words to describe this frightening cave. All I can think of is the verse from Isaiah. For in Topeth there has been prepared beforehand a pit, deep and wide, with straw and wood in plenty. The breath of Yahweh, like a stream of brimstone, will set fire to it. As I stood stunned, looking all around, a boy dashed out of a gate, screaming at the top of his lungs, as if falling into a lake of liquid bronze. He plunged into the center of the cave and immediately became incandescent and motionless, as his dying wail echoed in the distance. Struck with terror, I stared at him for a moment. He seemed to be one of my oratory boys. I asked my guide, "Isn't he so-and-so?" He responded, "Yes, indeed." "But why is he so still and incandescent, but doesn't burn out?" He replied, "You have chosen to see, so don't speak now, but watch, and you'll see. Furthermore, omnis enim igne salietur, et omnis victima sale salietur. Everyone shall be salted with fire, every victim shall be salted," which I remembered was a verse from the Gospel of Mark. I looked again and saw another lad hurtling down into the cave at high speed. He, too, was from the oratory and remained just as he fell. He, too, emitted a heart-rending shriek that blended in with the last echoes of the scream from the youth before him. Several other boys kept falling in increasing numbers, also screaming and becoming motionless and incandescent. I observed that the first seemed frozen, with one hand and one foot raised into the air. The second lad seemed almost bent in two and stuck to the floor. Many had their feet in the air, others their face on the ground. Still others remained in various positions, sitting or lying down, standing, kneeling, hands clutched in their hair. In short, the scene resembled a large statutory group of youngsters cast into ever more painful positions. Other lads fell into that same furnace. Some I knew, others I never met. I recalled that the book of Ecclesiastes says something to the effect that as you fall into hell, so you will forever remain. Lignum in quocumque loco ceciderunt, ibi exit. Where the tree falls, there it shall lie. Even more afraid, I asked my guide, "Do these boys know where they're going when they come hurtling into this cave?" "Of course they do. They were warned 1,000 times, but still chose to rush into the fire because they neither hated sin nor wanted to give it up. They despised and rejected God's merciful and continuing invitations to do penance. Provoked divine justice persecutes and hounds them so that they can't stop until they get here." Oh, how afflicted these poor boys must feel, knowing they no longer have any hope, I exclaimed. My guide answered, "If you want to know their inner frenzy and fury, draw closer." I took a few steps toward the window and saw many of those wretches savagely hitting one another like rabid dogs. Others were clawing their own faces and hands, tearing their own flesh, and spitefully throwing it about. At that point, the whole ceiling of the cave became as transparent as crystal and unveiled a patch of heaven and their radiant companions, saved forever. Fuming and panting with envy, the poor wretches burned with rage because they once mocked the just, as in Psalm 111, "The wicked shall see and shall be angry. he shall gnash his teeth and pine away. I asked my guide, "Why do I hear no voices?" "Draw closer," he shouted. Pressing my ear to the crystal window, I heard some screaming, sobbing, and writhing. Others blasphemed and insulted the saints. It was a shrill and confused tumult of voices and cries, so I asked my friend, "What are they saying? What are they shouting?" He answered, "When they remember the happy lot of their good companions, they're forced to admit, as it says in a verse from the Book of Wisdom, 'Fools that we were, their lives we deemed madness, and their deaths dishonored. See how they are accounted among the sons of God. Their lot is with the saints. We then have strayed from the way of the truth.' That's why they cry out, 'We had our fill of the ways of mischief and ruin. We journeyed through impassable deserts, but the way of the Lord we knew not. What did our pride avail us? All those things passed like a shadow.' Such are the mournful chants which shall echo here throughout eternity, but their shouts, efforts, and cries are all in vain. Omnis dolor iruet super eos. All evils will fall upon them, as it says in the book of Job. Here time is no more. Here is only eternity." A thought suddenly struck me as I, terrified, viewed the condition of many of my boys. How can all these boys here be damned? Last night they were still alive at the oratory. My friend answered, "The boys you see here are all dead to God's grace. They would be damned if they died now or persisted in their ways. But let's not waste our time. Let's move on." He led me away from that spot and down through a corridor into a deep cavern. Above its entrance were 2 Latin verses, the first from the Book of Wisdom and the second from the Book of Judith. "Their worm shall not die, and their fire shall not be quenched." And, "He will give fire and worms into their flesh, that they may burn and may feel forever." This showed how atrocious was the remorse of those who had been pupils in our schools, how tormented they were upon remembering each unforgiven sin and its just punishment, the countless and even extraordinary means available to mend their ways, persevere in virtue, and earn paradise, and their lack of correspondence to the many graces received from the Blessed Virgin Mary. Oh, how horrible to think they could have saved their souls so easily, but are now irredeemably lost, and to remember the many good resolutions they made but never kept. Indeed, hell is paved with good intentions, as the proverb says. Again, I saw in this profound cavern the oratory boys who had fallen into the fiery furnace. Some of them are listening to me right now. Others are former pupils or even strangers. As I got closer to them, I noticed they were covered with worms and disgusting animals that gnawed at their hearts, eyes, hands, legs, and whole bodies with indescribable fury. They were motionless, subject to every torment, and unable to defend themselves. I drew closer, hoping to speak with them and console them or hear something from them, but no one spoke or looked at me. I asked my guide why that was. He explained that the damned no longer have any freedom. Each must fully endure God's punishment with no reprieve whatsoever. He added, "Now you too must enter the fiery region you've seen." "Oh no," I objected, terrified. "One must be judged before going to hell, and I haven't been judged yet, so I don't want to go to hell." He said, "Tell me what you'd rather do. Visit hell and save your boys, or stay out and leave them in terrible agony?" I was stunned for a moment, and then answered, "I love my boys and want to save them all, but isn't there some way to avoid them and I going in there?" He said, "Yes, there is a way, but you must do everything you can." With a sigh of relief, I said to myself, I don't mind working hard as long as I can rescue these dear sons from such torments. "Come inside then," my friend went on, and see how our good Almighty God lovingly provides 1,000 means for guiding your boys to penance and saving them from everlasting death. He took my hand and led me into the cave. As I entered, I was suddenly transported into a magnificent hall with crystal doors and curtains covering more entrances to the cavern. Above one door, I read this inscription, "The Sixth Commandment." My guide pointed to it, exclaiming, "Transgressions of this commandment have caused the eternal ruin of many youths." But didn't they go to confession? They did, but they omitted or insufficiently confessed sins against the beautiful virtue of purity by saying, for example, that they had committed those sins 2 or 3 times when it was actually 4 or 5. Other boys may have committed that sin only once in their childhood, but were ashamed to confess it, or did so insufficiently. Still others were not really sorry, nor made a sincere resolution to avoid it in the future. Some, instead of examining their conscience, even spent time trying to figure out how best to deceive their confessor. He who dies in this state of mind chooses to be among the damned and is doomed for all eternity. Only those truly repentant, who die hoping for eternal salvation, will be forever happy. Now, do you want to see why God's mercy has brought you here? My guide lifted the curtain, and I saw a group of oratory boys, all known to me, who were there because of this sin. Some whose conduct seems to be good were among them. I asked, "Will you at least now let me write their names to warn them individually?" He answered, "It's not necessary." "What then do you suggest I tell them?" "Always preach against immodesty. A generic warning is enough, but remember that some will promise to amend if you admonish them individually, but will not always do so in earnest. God's grace is needed to have a firm resolution, and it will not be denied to your boys if they pray. God manifests his power especially by being merciful and forgiving. On your part, pray and make sacrifices. Let them listen to your admonitions and consult their conscience, which will tell them what to do." After we spent a half-hour discussing the requisites to make a good confession, my guide exclaimed several times in a loud voice, "Avertere! Avertere!" "What do you mean by that?" I asked. "Change your life." Stunned, I bowed my head as if about to withdraw, but he held me back and said, "You haven't seen everything yet." He turned and lifted another curtain with this inscription that was a verse taken from the first epistle to Timothy. Qui volunt divites fiere incidunt in tentationem et laqueum diaboli. Those who long to be rich fall prey to temptation and the snares of the devil. I countered, "This doesn't apply to my boys because they're as poor as I am. We neither are nor want to be rich. It doesn't cross our minds." However, as the curtain was lifted, I saw a group of boys all known to me. Like those I had seen earlier, they were in pain. My guide said, pointing to them, "As you can see, the inscription does apply to your boys." "How so? Can you explain?" I asked. He said, "For example, some of your boys are attached to material possessions, so their love of God is lessened, and they sin against charity, piety, and meekness. The mere desire for riches can corrupt one's heart, especially if that desire violates the virtue of justice. While your boys are poor, remember that greed and idleness are evil counselors. One of your boys has committed substantial thefts in his town and is not thinking of making restitution, even though he could do so. Others try to break into the pantry or the prefect's or purveyor's office, rummage in their colleagues' trunks for food, money, or other objects, steal stationery and books." After naming these and other boys, he said, "Some are here for having stolen clothing items, linen, blankets, and coats from the oratory wardrobe to send them home. Others for serious damage willfully done. Still others for not returning what they had borrowed, or for keeping money supposed to be handed over to their superior. Then he concluded, "Now that you know who they are, advise them to reject vain and harmful desires, to obey God's law, and to jealously safeguard their good name. Otherwise, greed will lead them to baleful excesses and plunge them into sorrow, death, and damnation." I couldn't understand why infractions the boys thought so little of led to such dreadful punishments. My guide interrupted my thoughts. "Remember what you were told when seeing the spoiled grapes on the vine." He thus lifted another curtain, hiding many of our oratory boys. I instantly recognized them all. An inscription on the curtain read, "Radix omnium malorum," the root of all evils. Then he asked me, "Do you know what this means? What sin is it?" To me, it would seem like pride. "No," he answered. "But I've always heard that pride is the root of all evil." "Generally speaking, it is. But do you know the particular fault that led Adam and Eve to commit the first sin, and which led to their being driven away from the earthly paradise?" "Disobedience?" "Yes, precisely. Disobedience is the root of all evil." "What should I tell my boys about this point?" "Listen carefully. The boys you see here are preparing a tearful end for themselves by being disobedient. So-and-so and so-and-so, who you think went to bed, leave the dormitory in the wee hours to roam about the playground. Disobeying orders, they go into dangerous construction areas and up scaffolds, endangering their lives. Others go to church but misbehave, ignoring the rules. They daydream or cause disturbances instead of praying. Some find a comfortable position to doze off during services, while others only make believe they're going to church but stay away. Woe to those who neglect prayer. They who do not pray doom themselves. Some boys are here because they read frivolous or even forbidden books instead of singing hymns or reciting the little office of the Blessed Virgin. He mentioned other serious disciplinary disorders. I was deeply moved when he finished and looked him in the eye, asking, "Can I mention all this to my boys?" "You can surely tell them all you remember." "What advice should I give them to save them from such a catastrophe?" "Keep insisting that they will be saved by obeying God, the church, their parents, and superiors, even in small things." "Any other instructions?" "Warn them against idleness, which led David to sin, and to keep always busy to deny the devil any opportunity to tempt them." I bowed my head, and I promised I would do so. I was so dismayed that I could only say, "Thank you for being so charitable to me, and please help me get out of here." He said, "Come with me." To encourage me, he took my hand and held me up as I could barely keep standing. We left that hall and quickly went back through that horrible courtyard and the long entrance corridor. As soon as we stepped across the last bronze portal, he turned to me and said, "Now that you have seen the torments that others suffer, you too must experience a bit of hell." "No, no," I cried, terrified. He insisted, but I kept refusing. "Fear not," he said. "Just touch this wall." I had lacked the courage to do it and tried to flee, but he held me back, insisting, "Try it." He gripped my arm firmly and pulled me to the wall, commanding, "Touch it at least once so you can say you saw and touched the walls of eternal torments. That way you will be able to understand what the last wall must be like if this first wall is so unbearable. Do you see this wall?" I carefully looked at the wall, which seemed incredibly thick. He continued, "There are 1,000 walls between this one and the real hellfire of hell. It is surrounded by 1,000 walls, each 1,000 meters thick and equally distant from the next. Each measure is 1,000 miles, so this wall stands millions of miles from hell's real fire. It is but a remote suburb of hell proper." I instinctively pulled back as he said that, but he seized my hand, opened it, and pressed it against the stone of that first of 1,000 walls. I felt such a burning pain that I jumped back with a loud scream. I immediately found myself sitting up in bed with a burning hand, which I kept rubbing to ease the pain. I noticed it was really swollen as I got up in the morning. Just that dream of having my hand pressed against the wall felt so real that the skin of my palm later peeled off. Note that I have not described these things in all their horror as I saw them, as they impressed me so as not to frighten you too much. As we know, our Lord always used symbols to portray hell because we wouldn't have understood him if he described it as it really is. No mortal can understand these things. The Lord knows and reveals them to whoever he wants. Still upset by this frightening dream, I was unable to fall asleep over the next several nights. I only have given you a short summary of extremely long dreams. Later I'll tell you about human respect, the 6th and 7th commandments, and pride. I'll explain these dreams without more ado because they're fully according to the Holy Scriptures and are only a commentary on their teachings concerning these matters. I told you a few things some nights ago, but whenever I have a chance, I'll tell you the rest and explain it. And with that, Don Bosco descended from the podium. As promised, Don Bosco later narrated a summarized version of this dream to the boys at Mirabello and Lanzo. In doing so, he introduced variations but made no substantial changes. The true Catholic can be serene, joyous, or even lively. He can be whatever is permissible by the commandments, but he must have a permanent foundation of seriousness. Look at St. John Bosco's picture. We see charity, tranquility, and serenity, but above all, we see a profound seriousness. But why? Because everything in life is serious, and we're dealing with the gravest and most serious thing that exists every day of our lives, our eternal destiny. Above all, for the Catholic, there is a celestial medicine for carrying the cross of seriousness, expressed in the ineffable words, Salve Regina, Hail Holy Queen, Mother of Mercy, our life, our sweetness, and our hope. Pray to Our Lady and make her smile. One smile from her gives us the strength for 100 years of seriousness. Thank you all so much for watching, and please consider helping me with a small monthly donation by following the link in the description below so that I can continue making videos and reach more people with the precious gift of the stories of St. John Bosco's life. God bless you, and may Our Lady keep you.
Dear brothers and sisters, today I speak to you about a great saint, a man of faith and dedication, Don Giovanni Bosco. He dedicated his life to the salvation of souls, especially those of young people, fighting with all his strength to rescue souls from the clutches of evil. His mission was directly inspired by the Lord, and in a dream he was granted a vision of hell itself, a warning for all of us, an invitation to avoid falling into the traps of the devil. Let me tell you about this vision so that you may understand its profound meaning and the warning that Don Bosco offers us. It was the night of April 17, 1868, when Don Bosco was visited by a heavenly guide, a distinguished figure who, like an angel, led him through a terrifying journey so that he could see and witness the traps the devil sets for the souls of young people. At the beginning of the dream, Don Bosco found himself in a vast, arid plain, a true, lifeless desert. The guide invited him to walk along a seemingly beautiful path, surrounded by hedges and magnificent flowers. But alas, that path, though appearing flat, actually descended into the abyss, leading with it the young people of the oratory, many of whom were unaware of the danger that awaited them. Don Bosco watched in horror as many of those young people fell along the way, caught by invisible snares that dragged them down into a frightening descent. These snares, the guide said, were the devil's traps: pride, disobedience, envy, impurity, gluttony, sloth, and wrath. These were the vices that chained souls and dragged them towards ruin. The greatest number of victims were those bound by the snares of pride, impurity, and disobedience. Don Bosco noticed how well hidden these snares were, almost invisible, and many young people fell into them without even realizing it. Some snares were set close to the ground, others hung from above, ready to catch anyone who passed by. Don Bosco wanted to examine one of these snares and pulled it towards himself, but he could not move it. He then decided to follow the string of the snare to its origin, eventually arriving at the entrance of a horrible cave. In front of him appeared a gigantic and repulsive monster, holding the ends of a rope with its claws to which all those snares were tied. The guide then said, "Now you know who drags young people into the abyss." Don Bosco immediately recognized that it was the devil himself who set those snares to make his young people fall into hell. As they continued their journey, Don Bosco and the guide found themselves in front of a path that became increasingly steep and rugged, full of holes, pebbles, and boulders. The way was difficult, and the landscape grew ever more desolate and dark. At the end of that path, they came upon an immense and shadowy building, a place that struck fear just by looking at it. Above a very high door was a frightening inscription: "Here there is no redemption." It was the entrance to hell. The guide, grabbing Don Bosco by the arm, said to him, "Look!" Trembling, Don Bosco raised his eyes and saw a young man rushing down towards that door. His hair was disheveled, his eyes wide with terror. His arms stretched out in front of him as if to protect himself from the fall. Don Bosco wanted to run to help him, but the guide held him back, saying, "Do you think you can stop one who flees from the wrath of God?" The young man crashed against the bronze door, which opened with a deafening roar. Behind it, other doors opened, one after another, up to 1,000, and from each came globes of fire while the young man sank into that abyss. Don Bosco saw other young people falling, one after another, screaming in terror as they fell into the abyss. Some were pushed by wicked companions, others were dragged by their own bad habits. The guide explained, "Here is the main cause of so many damnations: companions, bad books, perverse habits." Seeing the ruin of so many young people, Don Bosco exclaimed in despair, "Is it then useless for us to work in our colleges if so many young people end up like this?" The guide replied, "This is their current state, and if they were to die, they would certainly end up here. But there is still hope, as long as you do everything you can." Don Bosco then found himself facing a difficult choice. The guide invited him to enter through those doors, saying, "Come inside too, you will learn many things." Don Bosco, with a heavy heart, followed the guide into a narrow and dark corridor until they reached a gloomy opening with the inscription, "Ibuni impi in ignem aeternum," "The wicked shall go into eternal fire." The guide opened the opening and led Don Bosco inside. What Don Bosco saw filled him with indescribable terror. An immense cavern opened up before him, disappearing into the bowels of the earth. Everything was glowing from the fire: the walls, the ceiling, the floor. All was white and blazing from the heat. It was not the fire we know on earth with flickering flames. It was a fire that burned without consuming anything, a heat beyond imagination. Don Bosco saw a young man fall into that cavern, emitting a sharp scream as he was swallowed by the fire. He recognized the young man as one of the boys from his oratory. "Isn't this one of my young men?" he asked the guide. "Unfortunately, yes," was the answer. Don Bosco saw other young people follow the same fate, falling into the fire and remaining there, motionless, glowing like statues of pain. The guide explained that these young people had been warned 1,000 times, but they had refused God's mercy, deliberately choosing sin. Filled with horror, Don Bosco exclaimed, "What must be the despair of these unfortunate ones who have no hope of escape?" The guide urged him to reflect on the gravity of sin and the necessity of sincere repentance. The guide then ordered Don Bosco to touch one of the walls of the cavern to understand what hell was like. Don Bosco hesitated, but the guide forced him. As soon as his hand touched that wall, he felt such intense pain that he screamed and awoke from the dream. His hand was swollen, and in the following days the skin on his palm peeled off. It was a tangible sign of the reality he had seen and of the unimaginable pain of hell. Brothers and sisters, Don Bosco's message is clear. Hell is a reality that we cannot ignore. God's mercy is infinite, but it requires a response from us, an act of repentance and conversion. We cannot live in indifference. We cannot let the devil lay his snares around us and our loved ones. We must be vigilant, pray, confess sincerely, and avoid anything that could lead us away from God. Don Bosco teaches us that salvation is possible, that grace is available to all of us. But we must do everything within our power to avoid hell and to lead souls, especially those of our young people, towards salvation. May the Lord give us the strength to follow the path of virtue, to remain united with Him through prayer, the sacraments, and brotherly love. May the Lord bless you and protect you always.
This is a story about a woman on the verge of death from tuberculosis. She was a hardened sinner that had no interest in confessing her sins, and even threw a vase at St. Joseph Cafasso. Not even he, the priest of the gallows, could change her mind. Only St. John Bosco, cunning as a fox, managed to even approach her deathbed. We'll hear this inspiring conversation between saint and sinner in this episode of The Miracles and Prophecies of St. John Bosco, a project of America Needs Fatima. I'm your host, Matthew Miller. Before we begin this story, I just want to make it clear that our saint did not only seek after notorious evildoers in the confessional, but was equally as concerned with more scrupulous souls. Once, a fellow priest was exasperated in hearing the protracted confessions of pious women who prayed in the church all day, and our saint set him straight. Don Bosco wrote, "I remember that, early on, the parish priest of Castelnuovo used to criticize the so-called holy holies in private, and even from the pulpit. He said they wasted the confessor's time, could explain themselves better, and be more concise in their narrations. He suffered much because of that, as no one went to confession to him anymore. His words caused the villagers to distance themselves from him. All those wishing to confess went to the auxiliary pastor. One day he complained to me about this, and I pointed out Don Cafasso's advice. Invite people to come to confession frequently, invite them from the pulpit, and add that a priest is always ready and willing to hear confessions. I recommended that he treat those good women well in the confessional, use much charity and patience with them, and give them the task of leading others to confession. The parish priest thanked me and did as I suggested. In a short time, the entire village came to him for confession, and the number of communions in that parish increased greatly." Don Bosco asserted that those pious but scrupulous women did much good. He never allowed people to make jokes about them or call them holy holies. For the most part, he said that they're the spiritual support of a parish or even a country. Not caring for or mistreating them makes a whole country cold concerning the attendance of the sacraments. Having recourse to these good women is often the best way to make piety flourish in a population. They're zealous for worship in the house of God, work to prevent or remove scandal, and gather the means to promote a spiritual or corporal work of mercy. What usually makes them somewhat burdensome is only a little ignorance and excessive fear. Often they're innocent souls who go for years and years without sin, not only mortal, but even deliberate venial sin. If humiliated by a confessor, they no longer dare to approach him. They talk about it with their friends and acquaintances, and involuntarily stifle the piety of all those they approach. Keep this in mind. That being said, I will now relate our main story for today. In 1844, a woman in the last stage of tuberculosis was admitted to St. John's Hospital. Her life had been deplorable, and they feared she would die in despair and lose her soul. She was entangled in countless affairs, committed serious sins, financially harmed her neighbors, and had not approached the sacraments for many years. She furiously resisted requests by the hospital rector, chaplains, nuns, and all those who tried to persuade her to go to confession. The madwoman even threw a vase at Don Cafasso. However, this holy priest had learned from the doctors that the unfortunate woman only had a few days to live, and was sorry to see her go to eternity in that state. He returned to the boarding school and said to Don Bosco, "You must go." Don Bosco went. He entered the ward slowly, stopping to talk to the sick person on the bed next to his target. He never even glanced at her or said a word. Then he passed by her bed without stopping and talked with a sick woman lying on the other side. The suffering woman followed the priest with her eyes, and, seeing how he never stopped by her bed, said a word, or even looked at her, asked, "How come he does not stop by me?" "Oh yes, gladly," Don Bosco replied. He took a chair, sat by her bed, and said, "Well, tell me some soothing words. There's one word I want to say to you." "What is it?" "Confession." "Confession. It's been a long time since I went to confession." "So do it now." "Well, you see, this morning another priest came and wanted to hear my confession, but I mistreated him and made him leave." Don Bosco shook his head. "Let's not talk about that right now. Think about fixing your conscience." He began, "May God be in your heart," "But I'm not prepared for confession," the woman interrupted. "Because you aren't prepared, I've given you a blessing that you may be," replied Don Bosco. "But I don't feel like doing it now. When cured, I will go to confession in some church in Turin, or make my devotions here in the hospital chapel as soon as I can." "And do you think you can still get well?" "I'm feeling better now." "That's what it seems to you, but you're not." "How so?" "Do you want me to say a word on the doctor's behalf, or on God's behalf?" "Not on the doctor's behalf, but rather on behalf of God." "Well then, in God's name, I say to you that, in His mercy, He grants you a few more hours to think about your soul. It's 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and you still have time to confess and receive the holy oils and the papal blessing. Have no illusions. Tomorrow you will be in eternity." "Really? But that's not possible." "I told you that I'm not speaking to you on behalf of men, but on behalf of God." "Oh, eternity, eternity. What a word, it scares me." "Then let us begin," said Don Bosco. "I'll help you." "But I insulted that priest, and I'm sorry to think of my furious manners." "Don't doubt. Rest assured that I know that priest, and that's enough. Leave all that bother to me." The poor woman went to confession to him and died that very night in the state of grace. Thank you all so much for watching, and if you'd like to be included in our Saturday Mass intentions for the promoters of St. John Bosco, please follow the link in the description below. God bless you, and Our Lady keep you.
It was on May the 3rd, 1868, the feast of St. Joseph's patronage, when Don Bosco was instructing his boys and told them that he had a dream to tell them. He said he had not wanted to tell them, for it was very serious, but he had been ordered to by his guide. the man that Don Bosco called the man in the cap, who often accompanied him during his dreams. Don Bosco told the boys that one night his guide had appeared by his bedside and told Don Bosco that he must tell the boys his dreams, especially the one that was going to be revealed to him the following night. Learning that he was going to be shown another dream the following night, Don Bosco told the boys that he spent the whole day worrying, and when evening came, he was reluctant to go to bed. He sat at his desk, browsing through his books until midnight. Finally, with great effort, he went to bed. So that he would not fall asleep, he stacked up his pillows, but was so exhausted he went to sleep. Immediately, the man in the cap appeared and told Don Bosco to get up and follow him. Don Bosco was reluctant and pleaded that he had a toothache. The guide told him to get up, for he had no time to lose, and so Don Bosco went with him. They entered upon a broad road, which was beautiful and wide. There were flowers and hedges, and everything was lovely as Don Bosco walked along. But gradually it began to slope down. It was easy not to notice this, for it sloped down and was a long, long road, and Don Bosco worried how he would get back to his oratory. The guide told Don Bosco not to worry. He told him that the Almighty wanted him to go, and that he who led him on would also know how to lead him back. The road continued to slope down, still flanked with flowers and hedges. Gradually, Don Bosco noticed some boys from his oratory on the same broad road. Some were running. Some were walking with friends or alone. And there were traps upon the floor that suddenly caught them, made of what looked like spiders' webs. The traps bore inscriptions that read pride, disobedience, envy, sixth commandment, theft, gluttony, sloth, anger, and so on. The ones that trapped the boys the most were impurity, disobedience, and pride. A few boys were able to free themselves of the traps with knives or swords, which represented Holy Communion and the Blessed Virgin Mary. There was a hammer, symbolizing confession, and knives, symbolizing devotions to the saints. Amazed, Don Bosco and the guide continued along the road, which then began to change. The roses became scarcer, and terrible thorns appeared. They continued to walk for a long, long time, until the road became so steep they could hardly stand erect. Suddenly, Don Bosco found himself at the bottom of a precipice at the entrance of a valley. Don Bosco saw a large building with a towering portal facing the road. When he finally reached the bottom, he felt a suffocating heat. Green smoke, lit by flashes of scarlet flames, rose from behind the huge walls, which were as high as mountains. They were at the gates of hell. Don Bosco wanted to return to the oratory because of such a sight, but the guide prevented him. After walking around for a little, they made their way back to the first portal and watched. Don Bosco observed in terror as one of his boys came running down the path, his arms outstretched. He wanted to stop but could not. The guide warned Don Bosco not to try and stop the boy, saying, "Don't you know how terrible God's vengeance is? Do you think you can restrain one who is fleeing from his just wrath?" The portal sprung open with a roar, and the boy ran inside. Immediately, 1,000 other portals opened inside with a terrible sound. Far in the distance, Don Bosco saw a furnace spouting fireballs the moment the boy threw himself into it. The portals crashed swiftly shut. Other boys ran down the road towards the gates of hell, looking behind them in terror as they fled God's just wrath for their sins. The portal sprung open, and so did the other 1,000 as the boys fled into the endless corridor. Each time, the portals clanged shut behind them. Then, dead silence followed. The guide told Don Bosco that bad friends, bad books, and bad habits are mainly responsible for so many eternally lost. The traps were dragging many boys to ruin, and they were not using the spiritual weapons to cut themselves free. Don Bosco said that he wanted to warn the boys, but the guide asked if the boys really would change their lives if they were told. He said they would soon forget the warning. Others might well go to confession because of a momentary fear of hell, but would still be attached to their sins. In order to be saved, they must obey their superiors and the rules and receive the sacraments. The guide then led Don Bosco to the entrance of hell. They entered the corridor through which the boys had passed through and saw that it was covered with inscriptions. While the guide showed them to Don Bosco, he said that from here on, no one will ever again have a helpful friend or a loving heart or a compassionate glance. All that is gone forever. The guide then took Don Bosco through a corridor to an observation platform inside a cave. Once there, Don Bosco felt a great terror. The walls glowed white at temperatures of thousands of degrees, yet the fire did not incinerate nor consume anything. Don Bosco watched as a boy, screaming terribly, ran into the center of the cave. Instantly, he became incandescent and motionless. Another boy came, emitting a shriek that blended with the first. And then another who crouched down, screaming and clutching his hair in terror. All became equally motionless. Don Bosco asked his guide if the boys were aware of where they were. The guide explained that they were, for they had been warned 1,000 times. But they still choose to rush into the fire because they do not detest sin and do not wish to give it up. They despise and reject God's constant, merciful invitations to do penance. Therefore, divine justice follows them, and they cannot stop until they reach this place. Don Bosco wondered how the boys felt, knowing that they no longer had any hope. He stepped closer to look at their faces, just as the ceiling of the cave opened and revealed a part of heaven where their radiant friends were seen, safe for all eternity. In the cave there were the sounds of screams, blasphemies, sobs, and swearing. The boys' faces burned with rage and envy because they had once mocked good people. The guide explained to Don Bosco that when they recall the happy lot of their good friends, they admit that they had been fools. "We strayed far from truth," they cried. "We had our fill of the ways of mischief and ruin. What did our pride benefit us? All things have passed like a shadow. Here, time is no more. Here is only eternity." If boys persist in their evil ways and were to die now, the guide warned, they would be damned. Don Bosco realized how terrible the regret would be to remember each unforgiven sin and the countless ways that had been given for a boy to change, to persevere in virtue, and to earn heaven. How terrible to regret the lack of responding to the many favours given by Our Lady, and to remember the many good resolutions made but never kept, for the road to hell is paved with good intentions. The guide led Don Bosco down a corridor to a lower cavern, where he saw many boys amidst a fiery furnace, covered in worms and vermin, which ferociously gnawed their hearts, eyes, hands, and legs. They continued on, and the guide lifted a curtain to reveal another sign, beyond which was a group of boys in pain, like those seen before. Some of the boys are so attached to material possessions that their love of God is lessened, the guide explained. Even the desire of riches can corrupt the heart. Greed and idleness are bad counselors. Tell the boys to be busy at all times, because the devil will not then have a chance to tempt them. After this terrible tour, Don Bosco and the guide finally left, and were soon beyond the last bronze portal and at the gates of hell. The guide stopped Don Bosco and said that as he had seen what others suffer, he must touch the wall and experience a touch of hell, so that Don Bosco could say he had both seen and touched the walls of eternal suffering, and so that he would understand what the last wall must be like if the first is so unendurable. Don Bosco was horrified and could not touch the wall. The wall was incredibly thick. The guide told Don Bosco that there were 1,000 walls between this and the real fire of hell. 1,000 other walls encompass it, each 1,000 measures thick and equally distant from the next one. Each measure is 1,000 miles. The first wall, therefore, is millions and millions of miles from hell's real fire, just a remote rim of hell itself. Upon hearing this, Don Bosco instinctively pulled back, but the guide grabbed his hand. and pressed it against the first of the 1,000 walls. The feel of it was so horrific that with a scream Don Bosco found himself sitting in his bed back in his oratory. Don Bosco was horrified to find that his hand was stinging and in great pain. In the morning, his hand was swollen, and gradually the skin of the palm peeled off, confirming that what he had seen and done had been real. The boys listened to Don Bosco's dream with solemn amazement. He told them that he had not described things in all the horror that he had seen them, for he did not wish to frighten them too much. He then told the boys that our Lord always portrays hell in symbols, because we could never understand our Lord if hell was described as it really is. No mortal can comprehend these things, but hell is real and is the consequence of unrepentant sin. We must do all we can to avoid going there and help others to avoid hell too. Meditating upon hell and its realities always ignited a deep compassion in St. Don Bosco's heart for sinners that were threatened by such a terrible, eternal destination. He invited people to sincerely mend their ways, as we must too.
Hell from the eyes of St. John Bosco. We continued our descent, the road now becoming so frightfully steep that it was almost impossible to stand erect. And then, at the bottom of this precipice, at the entrance of a dark valley, an enormous building loomed into sight, its towering portal tightly locked, facing our road. When I finally got to the bottom, I became smothered by a suffocating heat, while a greasy green-tinted smoke, lit by flashes of scarlet flames, rose from behind those enormous walls which loomed higher than mountains. "Where are we? What is this?" I asked my guide. "Read the inscription on that portal and you will know." I looked up and read these words: "The place of no reprieve." I realized that we were at the gates of hell. The guide led me all around this horrible place. At regular distances, bronze portals like the first overlooked precipitous descents. On each was an inscription such as, "Depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels." Matthew 25. "Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire." Matthew 7:19. I tried to copy them into my notebook, but my guide restrained me. "There is no need. You have them all in Holy Scripture. You even have some of them inscribed in the porticos of your oratory." At such a sight, I wanted to turn back and return to the oratory. As a matter of fact, I did start back, but my guide ignored my attempt. After trudging through a steep, never-ending ravine, we again came to the foot of the precipice, facing the first portal. Suddenly, the guide turned to me. Upset and startled, he motioned to me to step aside. "Look," he said. I looked up in terror and saw in the distance someone racing down the path at an uncontrollable speed. I kept my eyes on him, trying to identify him, and as he got closer, I recognized him as one of my boys. His disheveled hair was partly standing upright on his head and partly tossed back by the wind. His arms were outstretched as though he were thrashing the water in an attempt to stay afloat. He wanted to stop but could not. Tripping on the protruding stones, he kept falling even faster. "Let's help him. Let's stop him," I shouted, holding out my hands in a vain effort to restrain him. "Leave him alone," the guide replied. "Why? Do you know how terrible God's vengeance is? Do you think you can restrain one who is fleeing from his just wrath?" Meanwhile, the youth had turned his fiery gaze backward in an attempt to see whether God's wrath were still pursuing him. The next moment, he fell trembling to the bottom of the ravine and crashed against the bronze portal as though he could find no better refuge in his flight. Why was he looking backward in terror, I asked. Because God's wrath will pierce hell's gates to reach and torment him even in the midst of fire. As a boy crashed into the portal, it sprang open with a roar, and instantly 1,000 inner portals opened with a deafening clamor, as if struck by a body that had been propelled by an invisible, most violent, irresistible gale. As these bronze doors, one behind the other, though at a considerable distance from each other, remained momentarily open, I saw far into the distance something like furnace jaws, sprouting fiery balls the moment the youth hurled into it. As swiftly as they had opened, the portals then clanged shut again. For a time, I tried to jot down the name of that unfortunate lad, but the guide again restrained me. "Wait," he ordered. "Watch." 3 other boys of ours, screaming in terror and with arms outstretched, were rolling down one behind the other like massive rocks. I recognized them as they too crashed against the portal. In that split second, it sprang open, and so did the other 1,000. The 3 lads were sucked into that endless corridor amid a long-drawn, fading infernal echo, and then the portals clanged shut again. At intervals, many other lads came tumbling down after them. I saw one unlucky boy being pushed down the slope by an evil companion. Others fell singly or with others, arm in arm or side by side. Each of them bore the name of his sin on his forehead. I kept calling to them as they hurled down, but they did not hear me. Again, the portals would open thunderously and slam shut with a rumble. Then, dead silence. "Bad companions, bad books, and bad habits," my guide exclaimed, "are mainly responsible for so many eternally lost." The traps I had seen earlier were indeed dragging the boys to ruin. Seeing so many going to damnation, I cried out disconsolately, "If so many of our boys end up this way, we are working in vain. How can we prevent such tragedies?" "This is their present state," my guide replied, "and that is where they would go if they were to die now." "Then let me jot down their names so that I may warn them and put them back on the path to heaven." "Do you really believe that some of them would reform if you were to warn them?" "Then and there your warning might impress them, but soon they will forget it, saying it was just a dream, and they will do worse than before. Others, realizing they have been unmasked, receive the sacraments, but this will neither be spontaneous nor meritorious. Others will go to confession because of a momentary fear of hell, but will still be attached to sin. Then is there no way to save these unfortunate lads? Please tell me what I can do for them. They have superiors, let them obey them. They have rules, let them observe them. They have the sacraments, let them receive them." Just then a new group of boys came hurling down, and the portals momentarily opened. "Let's go in," the guide said to me. I pulled back in horror. I could not wait to rush back to the oratory to warn the boys, lest others might be lost as well. "Come," my guide insisted. "You'll learn much, but first tell me, do you wish to go alone or with me?" He asked this to make me realize that I was not brave enough, and therefore needed his friendly assistance. "Alone inside that horrible place," I replied. "How will I ever be able to find my way out without your help?" Then a thought came to my mind and aroused my courage. "Before one is condemned to hell," I said to myself, "he must be judged, and I haven't been judged yet." "Let's go," I said resolutely. We entered that narrow, horrible corridor and whizzed through it with lightning speed. Threatening inscriptions shone eerily over all the inner gateways. The last one opened into a vast, grim courtyard with a large, unbelievably forbidding entrance at the far end. Above it stood this inscription: "They will go away into eternal punishment." Matthew 25:46. The walls all about were similarly inscribed. I asked my guide if I could read them, and he consented. These were the inscriptions: "Fire and worms he will give to their flesh. They shall weep in pain forever." Judith 16:17. "The lake of fire and brimstone where the beast and the false prophet will be tormented day and night forever and ever." Revelations 20:10. "And the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever." Revelations 14:11. "The land of gloom and chaos where light is as darkness." Job 10:22. "There is no peace for the wicked." Isaiah 48:22. "There men will weep and gnash their teeth." Matthew 8:12. While I moved from one inscription to another, my guide, who had stood in the center of the courtyard, came up to me. "From here on," he said, "no one may have a helpful companion, a comforting friend, a loving heart, a compassionate glance, or a benevolent word. All this is gone forever. Do you want to see, or would you rather experience these things yourself? I only want to see, I answered. Then come with me, my friend added, and taking me in tow, he stepped through that gate into a corridor at whose far end stood an observation platform, closed by a huge, single crystal plane reaching from the pavement to the ceiling. As soon as I crossed its threshold, I felt an indescribable terror and dared not take another step. Ahead of me, I could see something like an immense cave which gradually disappeared into recesses sunk far into the bowels of the mountains. They were all ablaze, but theirs were not an earthly fire with leaping tongues of flames. The entire cave, walls, ceiling, floor, iron, stones, wood, and coal, everything was glowing white at temperatures of thousands of degrees. Yet the fire did not incinerate, did not consume. I simply can't find the words to describe the cavern's horror. It is made ready, its pyre made deep and wide, with fire and wood in abundance. The breath of the Lord, like a stream of brimstone, kindles it. Isaiah 30:33. I was staring about me in bewilderment when a lad dashed out of a gate. Seemingly unaware of anything else, he emitted a most shrilling scream, like one who is about to fall into a cauldron of liquid bronze, and plummeted into the center of the cave. Instantly he too became incandescent and perfectly motionless, while the echo of his dying wail lingered for an instant more. Terribly frightened, I stared at him for a while. He seemed to be one of my oratory boys. Isn't he so-and-so? I asked my guide. Yes, was the answer. Why is he so still and incandescent? You chose to see, he replied. Be satisfied with that. Just keep looking. Besides, everyone will be salted with fire. Mark 9:49. As I looked again, another youth came hurling down into the cave at breakneck speed. He too was from the oratory. As he fell, so he remained. He too emitted one single heart-rending shriek that blended with that last echo of the scream that came from the youth who had preceded him. Other boys kept hurtling in the same way in increasing numbers, all screaming the same way, and then all becoming equally motionless and incandescent. I noticed that the first seemed frozen to the spot, one hand and one foot raised into the air. The second boy seemed bent almost double to the floor. Others stood or hung in various other positions, balancing themselves on one foot or hand, sitting or lying on their backs or on their sides, standing or kneeling, hands clutching their hair. Briefly, the scene resembled a large statuary group of youngsters, cast into ever more frightful positions. Other lads hurtled into that same furnace. Some I knew, others were strangers to me. I then recalled what is written in the Bible, to the effect that as one falls into hell, so he shall forever remain. In the place where the tree falls, there it will lie. Ecclesiasticus 11:3. More frightened than ever, I asked my guide, when these boys come dashing into this cave, don't they know where they are going? They surely do. They have been warned 1,000 times, but they still choose to rush into the fire because they do not detest sin and are loath to forsake it. Furthermore, they despise and reject God's incessant, merciful invitations to do penance. Thus provoked, divine justice harries them, hounds them, and goads them on so that they cannot halt until they reach this place. Oh, how miserable these unfortunate boys must feel in knowing they no longer have any hope, I exclaimed. If you really want to know their innermost frenzy and fury, go a little closer, my guide remarked. I took a few steps forward and saw that many of those poor wretches were savagely striking at each other like mad dogs. Others were clawing their own faces and hands, tearing their own flesh, and spitefully throwing it about. Just then the entire ceiling of the cave became as transparent as crystal and revealed a patch of heaven and their radiant companions, safe for all eternity. The poor wretches, fuming and panting with envy, burned with rage because they had once ridiculed the righteous. The wicked man sees it and is angry. He gnashes his teeth and melts away. Psalms 112:10. Why do I hear no sound? I asked my guide. Go closer, he advised. Pressing my ear to the crystal window, I heard screams and sobs, blasphemies and curses against the saints. It was a tumult of voices and cries, shrill and confused. When they recall the happy lot of their good companions, he replied, they are obliged to admit, We fools thought that their life was madness, and that their end was without honor. Behold how they numbered among the sons of God, and their lot is with the saints. It is we who have strayed from the way of truth, and the light of righteousness did not shine on us. We took our fill of the paths of lawlessness and destruction, and we journeyed through trackless deserts, but the way of the Lord we have not known. What has our arrogance profited us? And what good has our boasted wealth brought us? All those things have vanished like a shadow. Here time is no more. Here is only eternity. While I view the condition of many of my boys in utter terror, a thought suddenly struck me. How can these boys be damned? I asked. Last night they were alive still at the oratory. The boys you see here, he answered, are all dead to God's grace. Were they to die now or persist in their evil ways, they would be damned. But we are wasting time. Let us go on. He led me away, and we went down through a corridor into a lower cavern, at whose entrance I read, "Their worm shall not die, their fire shall not be quenched." Isaiah 66:24. Fire and worms he will give to their flesh. They shall weep in pain forever. Judith 16:17. Here one could see how atrocious was the remorse of those who had been pupils in our schools. What a torment was theirs to remember each unforgiven sin and its just punishment, the countless, even extraordinary means they had had to mend their ways, persevere in virtue, and earn paradise, and their lack of response to the many favors promised and bestowed by the Virgin Mary. What a torture to think that they could have been saved so easily, yet now are irredeemably lost, and to remember the many good resolutions made and never kept. Hell is indeed paved with good intentions. In this lower cavern, I saw those oratory boys who had fallen into the fiery furnace. Some are listening to me right now. Others are former pupils or even strangers to me. I drew closer to them and noticed that they were all covered with worms and vermin that gnawed at their vitals, hearts, eyes, hands, legs, and entire bodies so ferociously as to defy description. Helpless and motionless, they were prey to every kind of torment. Hoping I might be able to speak with them or to hear something from them, I drew even closer, but no one spoke or even looked at me. I then asked my guide why, and he explained that the damned are totally deprived of freedom. Each must fully endure his own punishment with absolutely no reprieve whatever. And now, he added, you too must enter that cavern. Oh no, I objected in terror. Before going to hell, one has to be judged. I have not been judged yet, so I will not go to hell. Listen, he said, what would you rather do? Visit hell and save your boys, or stay outside and leave them in agony? For a moment I was struck speechless. Of course I love my boys and wish to save them all, I replied. But isn't there some other way out? Yes, there is a way, he went on, provided you do all you can. I breathed more easily and instantly said to myself, I don't mind slaving, and if I can rescue some of these beloved sons of mine from such torments. Come inside, my friend went on, and see how our good Almighty God lovingly provides 1,000 means for guiding your boys to penance and saving them from everlasting death. Taking my hand, he led me into the cave. Inside, the guide showed St. John the common sins of the boys and the means God had provided for them to avoid hell. He advised about how he should counsel and preach to warn them. I bowed my head and promised to do as he had instructed. Faint with dismay, I could only mutter, thanks for having been so good to me. Now please lead me out of here. All right then, come with me. Encouragingly, he took my hand and held me up because I could hardly stand on my feet. Leaving that hall in no time at all, we retraced our steps through that horrible courtyard and the long corridor. But as soon as we stepped across the last bronze portal, he turned to me and said, now that you have seen what others suffer, you too must experience a touch of hell. No, no, I cried in horror. He insisted, but I kept refusing. Do not be afraid, he told me. Just try it. Touch this wall. I could not muster enough courage and tried to get away, but he held me back. Try it, he insisted. Gripping my arm firmly, he pulled me to the wall. Only one touch, he commanded, so that you may say you have both seen and touched the walls of eternal suffering, and that you may understand what the last wall must be like if the first is so unendurable. Look at this wall. I did look intently. It seemed incredibly thick. There are 1,000 walls between this and the real fire of hell. My God, continue. 1,000 walls encompass it, each 1,000 measures thick and equally distant from the next one. Each measure is 1,000 miles. This wall is therefore millions and millions of miles from hell's real fire. It is just a remote rim of hell itself. When he said this, I instinctively pulled back, but he seized my hand, forced it open, and pressed it against the first of the 1,000 walls. The sensation was so utterly excruciating that I leapt back with a scream and found myself sitting up in bed. My hand was stinging, and I kept rubbing it to ease the pain. When I got up this morning, I noticed that it was swollen. Having my hand pressed against the wall, though only in a dream, felt so real that later the skin of my palm peeled off. Bear in mind that I have tried not to frighten you very much, and so I have not described these things in all their horror as I saw them, and as they impress me. We know that our Lord always portrayed hell in symbols, because had he described it as it really is, we would not have understood him. No mortal can comprehend these things. The Lord knows them, and he reveals them to whomever he wills. My friends, meditate on that. See you tomorrow in day 4.